In this video, we're going to be doing just a small upgrade to my brakes on my Mark 7 Golf Sport wagon. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dad Wagon channel. Thank you for watching this video, or at least clicking on it at this point, and we are getting very close to 1,000 subscribers. So for all of you that are already subscribed, thank you so much. And if you're watching this video and like the content, think about subscribing to help us get over that 1,000 mark. As I alluded to at the intro of this video, today we're going to be working on the brakes for my sport wagon. We're going to be doing a couple maintenance items, and we're going to be doing a small tweak or upgrade. As far as maintenance goes, we're going to be changing the brake pads and changing out all 4 rotors. And the tweak or upgrade is we're going to be making a small change to the setup to accommodate a larger rotor size on the front wheels. We're now going to have a 312mm rotor up front instead of a 288mm in diameter rotor. So that's increasing that diameter by about 2.5 centimeters. The neat thing about this upgrade is we're actually going to be utilizing the same caliper setup that we already have. We're just going to be changing the caliper carrier. So that's the metal bracket that determines the spacing and how far your caliper sits away from the center of the hub. So you may be asking yourself, why would you want to do this upgrade if you're not going to change the caliper? Well, there's a couple reasons. I do believe it will be just a small increase in performance, but maybe a large difference in feel. By upgrading to a larger rotor, you're going to have more heat dissipation throughout the entire surface area. You're also going to have a little bit more leverage because it is a larger diameter rotor, so it should increase stopping power slightly, but you're not changing the diameter of your caliper piston by any means, so you'll be applying the same amount of pressure or force, but because it's spread out further from the center of the hub, you'll get a slight increase in stopping power. Also, it should feel a lot less grabby. If you've ever driven the standard Golf or the Sport Wagon, because it's using that same size piston as the Alltrack or the GTI and applying that same amount of force to a smaller rotor, the brakes do tend to feel a lot more grabby. For lack of a better word. So hopefully it will solve a little bit of that too. This is just a small tweak because there's actually cars in the MQB family that already use this setup. They have the same exact calipers as the Sport Wagon, but a different caliper carrier. So the Alltrack and the standard GTI, this is their exact brake setup. Now there are a couple ways to go about getting the right parts to accomplish this upgrade. You can go find used or new caliper carriers that are made for the Alltrack, the standard GTI, and I believe the e-Golf. They all use 312mm brake rotors. Or, in my case, because I found them cheaper actually this way, which is a little backwards, but I was able to go on eBay and find the caliper carriers and calipers for a standard GTI refurbished and repainted, ready to go as a set for about the same price, or actually less than I would have been able to buy caliper carriers. And after that, it really is plug and play. I know it's a little oversimplified, but since these are all OEM parts, everything bolts right up just like you took it off, just with a little bit of extra space. You will need bigger rotors when you place the order for those, obviously the 312, so you should be placing orders for either the Alltrack or GTI setup, and you will be needing different brake pads because the brake pads are what actually go into the caliper carrier, not into the caliper itself. The last thing I'll say before we get into the installation is head on over to golfmark7.com. It's a forum, and Google this because there are a few outliers and things you should check on your calipers just to make sure that this will work for your car. It is pretty universal, but there are a few outliers. Let's get started. Alright, my first step in this project was to remove the front calipers. To do this, you're going to need 2 wrenches, one to hold the pin in place and one to remove the bolt that holds the caliper on. There's one on the top and one on the bottom. Once you have both of those removed, go ahead and pull back on the caliper and remove that from your brakes. Now, you are going to need some way to suspend the caliper so you're not putting any pressure on the brake line. Sometimes you can balance it on the hub. A better option would be to tie it up or use a bungee cord and tie it up away and out of your workspace. Now that you have that caliper removed, go ahead and remove your brake pads. Alright, now it's time to remove your caliper carrier. There are 2 bolts that hold this in place, and they are pretty high torque, so they're going to take a lot of force to remove each of them. I'm using a breaker bar attached to my ratchet, which made that a much easier process. You will want to support your caliper carrier as you remove these bolts, because if you don't, there's nothing else holding on and it will fall to the ground. Now it's time to remove the rotor. I used a little bit of rust penetrant on the lock screw there. The best tool to remove these lock screws is a hand impact driver if you have one. Now, I do own one. Unfortunately, I don't have any Torx bits that fit it, so I had to go and use a ratchet. I'll be honest, on this one I'm even showing you, you can see I ended up stripping that screw and had to drill it out and re-tap everything to make sure it was nice and clean. And I did plan on replacing all of those set screws anyways and had extras ready to go. And now to remove that rotor, I didn't get it on camera. I used a short 2x4 and a hammer to loosen that up, slowly moving around the rotor since I wouldn't be reusing those. Once I got that rotor removed, I then cleaned the hub surface using some brake clean and got off any corrosion and rust to make sure there was a clean mating surface for the new rotors. Now at the time of filming this video, I did not have my set screws arrive yet, so I just used a couple lug nuts on each rotor to get them in place and make sure they were flush to the hub. Now this next step of fully disconnecting your caliper is optional, depending on which kit you bought. As I mentioned earlier in this video, I ended up buying new calipers and a new caliper carrier, so I decided to replace the calipers with the new refurbished ones. Now the caliper is attached to the brake line using what I believe is just considered a small banjo bolt. It may be something more specific. The key thing here is when you unscrew it, make sure you have something to catch the brake fluid that's trying to come out of there, and try not to get it on any of your parts because it is a very corrosive fluid. Now that you have the new rotor in place and removed the caliper, it's time to install the new caliper carrier that will accommodate the larger rotors. As you can see, I refinished this using a product called Super Wrap in this awesome red color. If you have questions about that, I did just make a video about that, so go back and check that one out. This is going to install the same way you removed it, so replacing those 2 caliper carrier bolts on the back side of your brake setup. With those carrier bolts in place, it's now time to tighten them up. I used a wrench and then went with the ratchet and the breaker bar to get things tightened up. And the one thing I'm not showing that I believe I show on the other wheels is I also made sure that there wasn't any interference between the caliper carrier and the new rotor, making sure everything fit by spinning that and making sure everything was looking right. With the rotors and carriers in place, I'm now able to install and fit my new brake pads. Here I'm going with EBC Red Stuff for my daily driving pad. If I ever do something more aggressive, I will probably switch, but I like this for a low dust option. With both pads in place, now I'm just applying some brake pad grease to both of the surface areas that are going to be in contact with the caliper to reduce any noises and squeaks. Start by gently getting the caliper in place and making sure that there's enough clearance to accommodate brand new pads, and then reinstalling the 2 caliper bolts. Now that everything's installed, you'll see me here spin the rotor again to make sure that there's not any sort of interference or anything is uneven. Depending on which parts you're replacing here, you may not need to do this step, but now I am reinstalling the brake line into the caliper. So now your front brakes have been upgraded to 312mm front rotors. Let's move on to the back and replace the pads and rotors there. So we're going to start in the same exact fashion as we did on the front by first removing the caliper, and there's 2 bolts that hold the caliper in place. Now here is one of the three main ways that the rear brakes are different than the front brakes. On the rear brakes, the caliper carrier isn't held on by hex bolts, but instead is held on by two triple square bolts. I will also say getting access to these is quite tough, and especially given the torque that you need to remove and reinstall them, it is a little bit of a pain. With both of those triple square bolts removed, go ahead and remove your caliper carrier. Using the same 2x4 method I used on the front brake rotors, I went and broke the rotor loose and removed it. It's good practice whenever you get new rotors to make sure you go ahead and clean both surfaces with brake clean, because generally they are coated with some sort of protectant or oil to make sure that they don't corrode during shipment. Now with a clean rotor, go ahead and get it in place. Now on your project, you may not need to remove the rear calipers either, but I chose to since I got the new calipers up front and painted them. I wanted to get the rears to match as well. Now with new rotors installed and some freshly painted caliper carriers as well as calipers, it's time to get everything installed. Again, you're going to work in reverse order of what you did to take everything off, just like you did on the front set of brakes. So for me, that means reinstalling the caliper carrier now and reinstalling the two triple square bolts that hold it on. Now, I've done a lot of brake jobs before in the past, mostly on older vehicles, and have never seen some calipers quite like this. So normally on a brake caliper, you need to push the piston back in to make room for the new larger brake pads, and normally you can do that with a vise and just putting pressure on the caliper and making sure that the valve is open. However, on these Volkswagen calipers, you need to both be applying pressure as well as turning the piston counterclockwise. Volkswagen, of course, does make a very specialized tool to do this, and in most cases you can rent one or buy one or borrow one. However, I didn't have that, didn't do my research enough to know that that was how it was going to work out. I was able to use some locking vice grips in order to get a good purchase on the piston and use a vise at the same time to turn that counterclockwise and push it back in. With the carriers in place and the caliper piston retracted as far as it will go, you can now go ahead and install your brake pads. With your brake grease applied to your brake pads, you can now go ahead and reinstall your caliper. And in my case, I'm going to also be reinstalling the brake line to that caliper. Now go ahead and tighten up those two bolts that hold the caliper in place. And the final step of your rear brake install is to reconnect your parking brake. So that wraps up this brake job. Well, kind of. I did, since I replaced the front calipers and took off the rears to paint them, I did have to bleed all four corners of the car. Obviously a very important step before you go driving again, and there are plenty of YouTube videos out there on how to bleed your brakes. Now that I've been driving the car for a little while, I can definitely say it does make a huge difference in how the brakes feel. They are much softer to brake with, less grabby as I mentioned, and it's just a much more smooth braking process at low speeds and at high speeds. As far as performance change, I don't have any objective data to share with you on that, and really haven't even pushed the car in that way just yet, as I'm still breaking in the brake pads. And finally, is this upgrade worth doing? I think for the price point you pay, it's definitely worth doing. It's a simple upgrade and gives you an idea of what bigger rotors are going to feel like. And then if you choose to move towards larger calipers and more pistons in your caliper, it's totally something that's an option. If you haven't looked into that too, make sure you do. There's a ton of options out there for the MQB platform, everything from Porsche to just out-of-the-box big brake kits. So that's going to wrap this up. As always, thank you for watching, thank you for subscribing, and stay tuned. We got some more videos coming very soon.